The biting wind swept across the battlements of Winterfell with a keening howl, carrying with it the scent of an early snowfall and the distant promise of approaching winter. The sun lingered low on the horizon, bleeding its last rays over the ancient stone walls. In that dying light, Lord Eddard Stark, Ned to his closest friends, stood overlooking the courtyard, deep in thought. Traditionally, House Stark knelt before the Iron Throne only under dire compulsion or after careful deliberation, always putting honor above convenience. Now, events had conspired to test that old vow of loyalty in a way that would echo for centuries. The letter he clutched bore an official seal, the corner bearing the sigil of a crown stag. A summons of sorts, or perhaps a demand, one that required an answer he was no longer willing to give. In earlier days, House Stark had bent the knee to kings in the South for the sake of unity and a peace that was always fragile. Yet times changed, thrones changed hands, and the North's sacrifices seemed to gain them only more demands. They had taken up arms repeatedly, lost good men, and endured crippling winters. Every generation of Starks had felt the cold creeping into their bones and the weight of duty strangling their hearts. But always they had persevered because that was what Starks did until now. Ned Stark had once tried to navigate the Viper's Nest in King's Landing. He had lost too much, his peace of mind, his illusions about honor in the southern courts, and nearly his life. If not for intervention at critical moments, the wheels of history might have crushed him. But they did not, and now he stood on this battlement ready to make the North's boldest decision in centuries. The scar on his right thigh ached, a lingering reminder of a confrontation with Jaime Lannister long ago. He had not forgotten the slight, nor forgiven it. Men in the South played their deadly games behind masks of courtesy, calling treason, justice, and murder expedients. He had witnessed how swiftly the tides could turn against those who prized truth. Even old, reliable friendships, like the one he'd believed he had with King Robert Baratheon, had become tenuous threads stretched across great distances. A single errant sword stroke could cut them forever. Letters from King's Landing had grown more insistent, each demanding the North's presence, forces, coin, or compliance. And with the tragedies that had befallen his family, Catelyn gone in a blaze of sorrow, Robb lost on the battlefield at the Red Wedding, Ned found himself no longer willing to bend before a throne that offered little but heartbreak in exchange. He tore the letter in half, letting the pieces flutter onto the courtyard below. His heart felt heavy as he turned to descend into the cold corridors of Winterfell. Pale lantern light guided him through winding hallways lined with tapestries older than the Seven Kingdoms. A hush had settled over the castle. Many had taken to bed early, worn out by the day's labors. But at the heart of the keep, a glow seeped from beneath the door of the great hall. Winterfell was alive this night, anticipating news of Lord Stark's decision. Rumors whispered through the servants that House Stark might finally declare the North free and sovereign again, as it had been before Aegon's conquest. Others, worried about retribution from the Iron Throne, insisted the talk was nonsense. The people's anxiety sizzled like static in the halls. They would not rest until they heard their lord's voice. Pushing open the great hall's heavy wooden doors, Ned found a gathering of his most trusted confidants. Seated at the high table, still as statues, were his children and advisors. Sansa, regal yet tired, wore a look of tempered resolve. Bran, seated beside her, commanded an aura of mysterious calm, a calm that had settled upon him ever since his journey beyond the wall and his mastery of arcane visions. Rickon, still young but tempered by the hardships of war, clenched his jaw in quiet determination. Davos Seaworth stood nearby, a loyal counselor, the smell of salt and sea about him despite being deep in the winter-bound north. Near them sat Meera Reed and a handful of trusted northern lords whose loyalty was beyond question. Lady Mormont, fierce as a she-bear, Lord Glover, grim-faced and resolute, and Wyman Manderly, whose girth and wit were both legendary. They had assembled to hear their lord's final word on the matter that might reshape the Seven Kingdoms. Ned's boots echoed on the stone floor, each step a heartbeat in the hush. All eyes turned to him. He cast his gaze over their faces, some anxious, some expectant, some flickering with resolve. Lady Mormont, who was often the first to speak her mind, waited in uncharacteristic silence, as though acknowledging the significance of Ned's announcement. Without preamble, he said, "I have decided." The words echoed, stark in that grand chamber. "We have given too much, lost too many. The North has fought in war after war to secure the ambitions of men in the South, and we have been rewarded with heartbreak. Today, we say no more. The North will not bow. From this day forth, we refuse to bend the knee to any king. Let the North stand independent as it was in the days of the kings of winter." A collective breath seemed to leave the room as if the castle itself exhaled relief and trepidation. The northern lords exchanged glances and Lady Mormont stood. Her voice rang clear, "We stand with House Stark." A cheer, quiet at first, began to ripple through the hall, building in strength. Stewards in the corners dared to speak out, to lift their fists, to voice a surge of long-buried pride. Rickon's eyes shone with excitement. Sansa allowed a small, determined smile. Bran inclined his head in a gesture that said he already knew this was coming. In that moment, their unity felt unbreakable. The nights of terror, the days of war, the heartbreaks and betrayals had all led to this decision that would either free the North or bring the wrath of the Iron Throne upon them. No one doubted that war would follow. But a hush settled again as Davos Seaworth rose to speak, clearing his throat in the hush. "Lord," he said, gentler than the rest, "we know the cost of this choice. The North is strong and proud, but we haven't the numbers to stand alone against all the southern kingdoms combined. War will come. We must be ready." Ned nodded. "We will be. Let them come if they wish. They'll find a unified North prepared to defend its own at any cost." Such words lit a fire in the hall. Though Davos had voiced caution, he also recognized that the North needed this rallying cry. The lords roared their agreement, fists pounding on tables. In that thunderous applause, the old walls of Winterfell felt newly alive, almost as if the ancients whose statues lined the crypts below had stirred in their stone slumber to give their silent blessings. But beneath the exhilaration, a flicker of fear remained. The North was vast, but it wasn't as populous as the other 6 kingdoms. Every man and woman might need to take up arms in the end. Long after the gathering dispersed, Ned remained behind. He felt the magnitude of what had been done. Centuries of tradition, suzerainty, and precarious alliances had been cast aside with a handful of words. At last, this moment of defiance had come, and with it, the uncertain dawn of a new era for his house. Could the North truly stand on its own? He thought of the Baratheons, Lannisters, Targaryens, Tyrells, and all the rest who had once donned crowns or claimed them. He knew they would not let the North slip away without a challenge. But that did not matter. The die was cast. In the midnight hush, Ned climbed the steps to his bedchamber, the corridor lit by flickering torches that made the shadows dance. As he passed a narrow window, he looked out upon the winter sky, the stars glimmering cold and fierce. A snowflake drifted by, brushing the sill. Winter was truly at hand, but he felt no dread. He felt only an abiding sense of righteousness, knowing that even if House Stark should stand alone, it would do so with unbroken honor. A single snowflake in a blizzard might seem insignificant, but a million snowflakes together could bury entire armies. His vigil in the dimly lit room drew him into reflection. He remembered how, as a boy, he would accompany his father, Lord Rickard Stark, to the crypts where the statues of old kings in the North loomed. The crypts always seemed to whisper their secrets about an age when Starks wore crowns of their own, forging alliances with steel and holding out against winter's cruelty. Those days had ended with the Targaryen conquest, but the memory still burned in northern veins. Perhaps it had always been waiting for a moment to awaken. And now Ned had lit that spark. When dawn broke, the news spread like wildfire through the castle and the surrounding lands. The wind carried rumors to the furthest farmsteads. House Stark declared independence. The North would have no king but its own. Some expressed jubilation, chanting the old titles, kings in the North, winter kings. Others reacted with quiet apprehension. The small folk whose lives might be turned inside out by war prayed for guidance and prepared for hardship. Old alliances with the Vale or the Riverlands were uncertain now. Trade routes that brought grain from the fertile south could be severed. But still, the strong hearts of the North rallied. Winterfell's gates bustled as men flocked in to pledge swords. The blacksmith's forge roared day and night, forging new spears, swords, and axes. In the yard, as the first snow of the season drifted in lazy spirals, Ned surveyed the soldiers mustering there. He saw no fear in their eyes, only a grim readiness. Lady Mormont had arrived with a band of Bear Island warriors, each one fierce and loyal. The Glovers sent a contingent of their best. The Umbers from Last Hearth, the Serwins from Serwyn Castle, and many more had answered Winterfell's call. Even the mountain clans of the North, famously independent, dispatched their stout-hearted fighters. For the first time in living memory, a wave of unified northern pride bound them all. They were Starks, Umbers, Glovers, Mormonts, yet above all, they were Northerners. Sansa had taken on the logistical burden, summoning stores of grain and salted meats. She organized caravans that traveled between holdfasts, ensuring that if hostilities erupted with the South, the North would not starve. Over the years, she had learned to navigate the labyrinth of courtly etiquette, but also the practicalities of managing a household and an army. She had come into her own, no longer the naive girl dreaming of lemon cakes and gallant knights. Pain and adversity had tempered her into a savvy diplomat. Now, she coordinated supply lines as effectively as a southern lady might conduct elaborate feasts. Rickon, still young enough to burn hot with passion, donned leathers and practiced daily with sword and bow. He yearned to prove himself in this cause, to show that he was no longer the child who had once scampered through these same courtyards. Sometimes Ned watched him from a distance, heart heavy with the knowledge that youth was too often sacrificed on the altar of war. But he could not deny Rickon the right to stand up for his homeland. Not now, in the hour of House Stark's greatest test. Bran rarely came down from his tower except to attend vital gatherings. His eyes seemed to hold knowledge far beyond his years, as though he had seen all this before in some vision granted by the weirwood trees. When he spoke, it was often cryptic, hinting at a destiny far greater than just the North's independence. Yet his counsel, delivered in calm, measured tones, reassured those around him that their path was just. He insisted that the land itself supported their choice, that the ancient spirits of the North yearned for this reclamation of freedom. Word eventually reached King's Landing. The reigning monarch, Tommen Baratheon in name, though the Lannisters' Golden Lion overshadowed the Stag, received urgent reports that the North had declared secession. At first, the Southern court laughed it off as impossible. Were the Starks truly so brazen after all the tragedies they had endured? Yet as more ravens arrived, the shock set in. The North had crowned no one, yet they had simply renounced fealty. They stood alone, unbending, calling themselves a free people. For those at court, it was unthinkable. The Iron Throne, historically shaped by the swords of conquered foes, could not ignore the North. Whispers in the Red Keep turned to alarm. Advisors reminded Tommen and his council that the North was the largest of the 7 kingdoms by land area, though it had fewer inhabitants. Losing it would fracture the realm. The Iron Throne's authority had been questioned before by the Iron Islands, by Dorne in centuries past, but never so boldly by the entire North. Cersei Lannister, the Queen Mother, was said to have raged in her chambers upon hearing the news. Varys, the Spider, was rumored to spin his webs of secret alliances to quell this threat. Grand Maester Pycelle expressed worry that a new war so soon after the War of the Five Kings would destabilize everything. Yet even as the Southern lords debated, ridiculed, and raged, the North continued on its path. In time, ravens arrived at Winterfell bearing messages from King's Landing. Demands for submission, threats of reprisal, and veiled offers of pardons if House Stark would reverse course. One letter in particular was scorching in tone. The small council declared that if the Starks did not end this folly, the full might of the Iron Throne would be unleashed. They mentioned the gold of Casterly Rock, the armies of the Reach, and the fleets of the Redwyne Straits. They mentioned that the Starks would be branded traitors to the crown. They invoked the memory of what befell rebellious houses in times past, castles burned, lines extinguished. Ned met these threats with grim resolve. He read them in the privacy of his solar, pressing his lips into a thin line. Then he set them aside with a dismissive flick of his wrist. With each threat, the North's position hardened. No more bending the knee. No more illusions that the South would ever treat them with genuine respect. By refusing to kneel, the North was forging its own identity, and that was worth the price. Ravens from other realms arrived as well. In the Vale, Lord Robin Arryn's regents debated whether to assist the Starks or remain neutral. In the Riverlands, certain Tully loyalists sympathized with House Stark but feared retribution. In Dorne, some lords actually smirked with approval, recalling their own fierce independence, though they were in no hurry to spark open conflict. The Iron Islands, under their own shifting leadership, pondered how best to exploit the chaos. An undercurrent of tension crackled everywhere. As the first moon of winter rolled on, northern delegations departed Winterfell to entrench alliances or at least encourage neutrality among potential foes. Davos Seaworth traveled south to speak with any lords who might heed reason or at least see advantage in avoiding a costly war. The practical man of the sea took no illusions with him, only his sincere plea that the North's autonomy need not plunge the entire continent into flames. Some lords he met listened thoughtfully, others slammed their doors in his face or demanded bribes. Always, the lion's shadow loomed. Cersei Lannister was mustering allies, offering lands or gold to houses that would march against the North. Then came the day the first Southern outriders appeared at Moat Cailin. A few ragged men in the service of lesser lords, perhaps scouting the territory or verifying the rumors. They were turned away with a curt warning from the garrison that Moat Cailin was closed to all who came bearing demands of the Iron Throne. The Outriders galloped back south, and soon ravens carried word that a southern host was gathering, led by none other than Ser Jaime Lannister and supported by lords sworn to the crown. Though the North's cause was just in the eyes of its people, Ned knew the Lannister name struck fear in many hearts. Jaime had grown into a formidable general, seasoned by years of warfare. The southern host would not be large at first, but it signaled the crown's intent. This was no mere negotiation or idle threat. War was coming. Ned prepared. The North prepared. Supplies, arms, fortifications, every holdfast was told to brace for a siege, to keep an eye on the roads, to gather harvests and store them before winter set in fully. The lords of the North might be fewer in number compared to their southern counterparts, but they knew their land. They knew the secrets of the winter terrain, the hidden passes, and the best vantage points to cut off supply lines. If the Lannisters insisted on bringing war northward, they would find no welcoming hearth, only a string of cunning ambushes and withering cold. Even if the southern forces boasted tens of thousands of swords, they would have to trek over boggy fields, wind-blasted moors, and frozen rivers to reach Winterfell. While they awaited the southern army's approach, the North closed ranks. Sansa ensured the morale of the small folk by guaranteeing rations, something she had learned from her time in King's Landing. Rickon and the Umbers patrolled, leading small bands of riders across the outskirts. Meera Reed and her brother scouted the swamps near the Neck, using their deep knowledge of the land to hamper any southern vanguard from slipping through unnoticed. The onset of early snow worked in the North's favor, turning the roads into dangerous slicks of ice and mud. Amid the bustle, Bran walked alone in the Godswood, sometimes for hours, communing with the old weirwood tree. He placed his hand upon the carved face, eyes rolling back in a trance. Now and again, he emerged with cryptic whispers that left those around him uneasy. One day he told Ned, "Father, be mindful of the sea. The storms do not always come from the land." Ned didn't fully grasp the meaning, but he assigned watchers to the coasts, suspecting that perhaps the Iron Fleet or another maritime force might try to land. Whatever was coming, Ned took every precaution. He had not cast aside his vow to the throne lightly. He was a man of honor, but also a man of duty. Should the Iron Throne come for the North, he intended to meet them as an equal, not a vassal. Winter deepened its hold. Snow piled in the courtyards, often cleared away by bleary-eyed stable hands and stewards. The frozen nights seemed endless, broken only by the howling of wolves. The stark direwolves, once scattered by war, had begun to return to the edges of the forest surrounding Winterfell. People spoke in awe of glimpses of great gray shapes prowling at dusk. Some even saw a hulking white wolf near the gate, though that might have been rumor. It emboldened the hearts of the North. The old magic of the land seemed to stir, as if answering the call of a free North. Finally, word came that Jaime Lannister's advance forces, along with some bannermen from the Crownlands, had reached the outskirts of Moat Cailin, a strategic fortress controlling the mainland route into the north. The fortress was old, partially in ruins, but formidable enough in that narrow neck of land. A small northern garrison manned the walls under the banner of the Starks. The men had prepared spiked pits, oil, and archers well-versed in making every arrow count. When the southern knights approached under a white banner to parley, they found an unyielding line of northern archers perched high on the shattered towers. The messenger, a knight in golden armor, shouted for the garrison to surrender and reaffirm their loyalty to the crown. The North's reply was a single arrow landing at the messenger's feet. The meaning was clear. The parley ended before it began. Jaime Lannister was no fool. He ordered his troops to construct siege lines, but the swampy terrain bogged them down. Disease began to creep through the camp. Supplies, promised by certain southern houses, arrived late, hampered by the deteriorating roads and a handful of Manderly-led raids. Each passing day, the North's advantage grew as the southern forces found themselves stuck in what seemed a fruitless endeavor. Still, they persisted. The Lannisters could not simply retreat. Defiance unchecked would breed more defiance, or so their logic ran. House Lannister's pride demanded they break the North's resistance. Word soon spread that other southern lords were assembling a second wave. The Tyrells of the Reach, cautious after their own previous entanglements, hesitated, but the crown pressed every alliance, drawing on the prestige of the Iron Throne. Smaller houses that once declared fealty to Targaryens, Baratheons, or Lannisters were coerced with gold. A larger southern army prepared to march as soon as the roads were passable. In Winterfell, Ned watched the situation at Moat Cailin unfold. Reports trickled in daily, the southern camp in disarray, their wounded piling up, the swampy land draining morale. The small northern garrison held firm behind the fortress walls. The news was encouraging, but Ned knew better than to rejoice prematurely. The Lannisters were relentless and the crown's resources were extensive. It was only a matter of time before fresh southern regiments arrived to reinforce Jaime's position, and once they found a stable approach, they would hammer the fortress relentlessly. The question was whether the North could force the South to the negotiating table before a large-scale invasion occurred. Davos Seaworth returned to Winterfell after his travels, face etched with care. He brought both good and bad tidings. The good, some houses in the Riverlands, still bitter over the Red Wedding, had no love for the Lannisters or Freys. They might refuse passage or make it difficult for the Crown's armies to cross their lands. The bad, others, more pragmatic or simply terrified, would not stand in the North's defense. They had lost too much in previous wars. They would stand aside or nominally aid the Crown, wanting no more trouble. The mood in the hall as Davos spoke was somber. They were alone, yet not entirely without hidden friends. "I've done my best, Lord," Davos said quietly. "But the fear of Lannister gold and the royal retribution is still strong. Few will risk open rebellion. They'd rather see how this plays out first." Ned nodded. "They watch like carrion crows, waiting to see which side emerges weaker. So be it. The North will remember who stood with us and who did not." Days melted into weeks as the stalemate at Moat Cailin held. The men there fought off a few half-hearted southern assaults. Arrows rained down from the old crenellations, and the bogs around the fortress swallowed horses and men alike. But in time, the southern reinforcements, led by lords from the Crownlands and even a minor contingent from the Stormlands, arrived to bolster Jaime's lines. With fresh supplies and siege weapons, the Lannisters renewed their assault. When the fortress at Moat Cailin fell, it did so in a storm of fire. One night, the watchers on the battlements of Winterfell saw an orange glow on the southern horizon. Word arrived by Raven at dawn. The southern catapults had hurled flaming pitch into the old wooden structures. Parts of the fortress collapsed in on themselves. Still, the northern defenders refused to yield until the last tower was overrun. By that time, they had inflicted terrible losses on the Lannister ranks. When the news reached Winterfell, the lords of the North set their jaws. There would be no easy peace now. The North's blood had been spilled, and the Crown had shown its willingness to burn and destroy to reclaim control. The conflict had officially begun. Jaime Lannister pressed forward, moving slowly north. The harsh terrain and the cunning harassment tactics employed by northern riders slowed his progress. Every day he lost men to surprise attacks or simple exposure. The golden banners he had brought from the south looked tattered under the gray skies, spattered with mud. Rumors said Jaime himself was beginning to wonder if he was marching into a trap laid by the weather itself. Meanwhile, Ned Stark called his lords to assemble their forces along the King's Road. Ancient houses and small clans alike answered the summons until a patchwork northern army stood in readiness. Commanders were assigned to each region, and together they planned how to lure the southern host deeper into unfamiliar territory. The plan was simple: bleed them slowly, force them to encamp in places devoid of resources, let the cold nights gnaw at them. By the time they reached the outskirts of Winterfell, they would be a fraction of their original strength. Ned did not relish the idea of a pitched battle near his ancestral home, but if it came to that, the North would stand united. Sansa orchestrated what might be called a shadow front in parallel with the Marshall campaign. She reached out through old friends, employing cunning to spread the idea that the North merely wanted peace and self-determination. She wrote letters to influential women in the southern courts, hinting that the Lannisters and the Iron Throne were waging a war of domination rather than justice. She sought to chip away at the alliances that held the southern armies together, hoping to sow seeds of doubt. It was a subtle game, and she played it from afar, letting ravens carry her words to those who might listen. Whether it would yield fruit or not remained uncertain, but it was worth the attempt. Snow fell heavier as Jaime's forces advanced another day's march. His outriders approached the edges of a dense forest. Beyond the forest stretched a plain leading to the White Knife River, which wound its way east toward White Harbor. The plan, from what the North could glean, was for Jaime to meet with a southern fleet at White Harbor and secure a steady supply line to feed and equip his men. If that happened, the conflict could become far more dangerous for the North. Ned decided on a bold move. He called for a force of light cavalry under Rickon Stark and Lord Glover to slip through the forest and strike at the southern lines, possibly scattering them long enough to prevent a rendezvous with the fleet. Rickon, thrilled to lead, donned his wolf-head helm and set out at once. He was accompanied by one of the old Stark retainers, Helman Tallheart, who had taught him how to read the land. They moved swiftly, using hidden trails, keeping their numbers small to maximize mobility. The resulting ambush was a stunning victory for the North. As Jaime's vanguard emerged from the wooded outskirts onto an open field, Rickon's riders swooped down from the treeline, howling their war cries. The Southern Knights were caught off guard, scrambled to form ranks, and fell into chaos when Northern arrows rained upon them from unseen positions. Some dropped their weapons to flee into the forest, only to be picked off by silent hunters. Others managed to rally around Jaime, who fought with a skill that was the stuff of legends, but even he could not halt the rout. Rickon himself engaged in close combat, the adrenaline of youth and the stern training he had received turning him into a fearless presence on the battlefield. By day's end, the southern vanguard lay scattered, and Jaime was forced to retreat. Cheers erupted throughout the north when they heard that Jaime Lannister had been checked and driven back. The northern host seized supplies left behind, along with the battered remnants of the crown's banners. Encouraged by this success, more northern lords flocked to Winterfell with additional troops. It seemed the dream of a free north was within reach, especially if they could keep the Lannisters from establishing a secure supply route. But the war was far from won. More southern forces were rumored to be marching north, including some from the Stormlands and possibly even a small Tyrell contingent drawn by the chance to gain favor at King's Landing. The very notion of the Tyrells, whose domain was flush with resources, lending their armies in the middle of winter worried Ned, because they could sustain a prolonged campaign. Still, the difficulties of the northern terrain would hamper them. In that sense, the weather remained the North's best ally. Amid the flurry of planning for the next confrontation, Ned allowed himself a moment of quiet reflection in the Godswood. He knelt by the pool, gazing at the reflection of the weirwood's carved face. The red leaves, still clinging to the ancient branches, reminded him of the blood that had already been spilled. He prayed for guidance for the safety of his people. He prayed that the path he'd chosen would not lead to the destruction of House Stark. Yet even in his doubts, he felt a sense of righteousness. He had been forced into a corner too many times by the politics of the South. This stand for independence was not a whim, it was a necessity if the North was ever to have peace on its own terms. There in the stillness, he heard the crunch of snow behind him. Turning, he found Bran watching him with his far-seeing eyes. The young man approached slowly, his gaze distant and grave. "Father," Bran said softly, "I have seen many possible futures, but in each, the North remains resolute. The land responds to our choice. The old gods watch and they do not condemn us." Ned rose, placing a hand on Bran's shoulder. "I am glad of it, son. We need every blessing we can get." Bran's gaze flickered. "Beware the temptations to betray our cause for short-term gain. Beware the dragons. The old gods speak in riddles, but they hint of dragonfire. It might come from across the sea or from the line once dethroned. Fire and blood, that was their motto." Ned frowned, recalling the Targaryen lineage. Were there still Targaryens out there with claims? Rumors abounded of Daenerys Targaryen across the narrow sea, but no one had confirmed her status for some time. It was a concern, but not immediate. The threat in front of them was Lannister gold and the southern armies. He nodded to Bran, filing the warning away. Bran left, leaving Ned alone with his thoughts. What the North needed now was a decisive blow to push the southern armies back or force them into negotiations. With Moat Cailin taken, the easiest route into the North lay open, but the North could still harry the invaders at every turn. The bigger question was whether the Crown would bring its full might, turning the war into a prolonged siege. Such a scenario would be devastating, with winter's grip intensifying. Civilians would suffer and the land might be ravaged for generations. Ned was no warmonger, but refusing to bend the knee had left the Crown with a stark choice: accept the North's independence or subjugate it by force. The time for half measures was gone. Determination steeled his heart, and as he walked back into the castle, he felt the presence of his ancestors in every corridor. The Starks who had once worn crowns in the North were with him in spirit, urging him onward. A raven came from White Harbor with urgent news. A royal fleet had been sighted off the coast, presumably aiming to link up with Jaime's forces. This was the next stage in the southern effort. If they managed to unload enough soldiers and supplies, the North's advantage would diminish. Lord Wyman Manderley, loyal and always flamboyant, roused his city's defenses, intending to delay any landing for as long as possible. But White Harbor alone might not hold off an entire fleet. The time had come for the North to gather its main army in March. Winterfell bustled with final preparations. Sansa organized caravans to follow the troops, bearing medical supplies and rations. Rickon, fresh from his victory, itched to ride out again. Bran would remain at Winterfell, as his abilities could be crucial for receiving prophetic warnings. The northern lords assembled in the courtyard, banners snapping in the wind: the grey direwolf of Stark, the bear of Mormont, the roaring giant of Umber, the merman of Manderley, the stag-and-wolf sigil that Davos occasionally carried to honor his past, though it wasn't flown openly, of course, and so many others. The host that formed was not as grand in sheer numbers as some southern armies, but it was a force of seasoned warriors on their home terrain. More importantly, they believed, heart and soul, in their cause. Ned addressed his army just before departure, standing on a raised platform overlooking the courtyard. Men and women of the North, we stand at the brink of a new age. Our cause is just to live free and govern ourselves by our own laws. We do not seek conquest. We do not seek to oppress others. We only seek the freedom that was once ours. If the South attempts to chain us, we will break those chains with ice and steel. Winter is upon us, and in winter the North endures. We fight not only for ourselves, but for our children and their children after them. March with me now and show the world that the North will not kneel. A thundering cheer answered him. As the gates of Winterfell opened, the northern host began its march southward, leaving behind only those needed to protect the castle. Wolves howled in the distance as if saluting their departure. The snowfall had tapered off for the moment, but the sky loomed gray, promising more to come. They traveled slowly, mindful of the weather. Scouts rode ahead, searching for signs of the Lannister forces. Veterans recognized the hush in the air as an omen of a battle to come. The foot soldiers trudged in furs and cloaks, breath steaming in the frigid dawns. Nights were spent huddled around fires, the flickering flames offering small comfort against the encroaching cold. Occasionally, they crossed old watchtowers or abandoned villages, grim reminders that the North was not always gentle to its inhabitants, especially in times of war. By the time they neared the White Knife's western bend, ravens told them that Jaime Lannister was also on the march, attempting to converge with the royal fleet at White Harbor. It became a race. Ned ordered his cavalry forward to prevent Jaime's men from marching unopposed. The northern infantry followed more slowly, protecting the baggage train. At every turn, the local smallfolk offered bits of help. A hidden path through the woods, a store of grain carefully hidden from southern foragers, or even intelligence about the enemy's movements. The cause bound the North together like never before. The culminating battle seemed to choose its ground at the edge of the river near a small hamlet called Rivermeet. The terrain favored neither side distinctly. It was relatively open, bordered by thick woods on one flank and the winding White Knife on the other. Scouts reported that Jaime's forces, strengthened by a partial link-up with men from the fleet, had established a fortified position here. They intended to hold out until the rest of the fleet's soldiers could disembark and join them. If the North could strike quickly and overwhelm Jaime's camp, they might scatter the southern threat before it fully coalesced. Ned called a war council. Lords Mormont, Glover, Manderley, Umber, and others gathered around a rough map drawn in the dirt. Sansa and Davos offered strategic insights. Rickon insisted on taking the vanguard once more, determined to repeat his earlier success. Meera Reed volunteered to lead a flanking maneuver through the wooded area, using her knowledge of swampland tactics. The plan took shape, a swift frontal assault by Rickon, supported by archers and foot soldiers, while Meera's flanking force attacked the Lannisters' rear, hopefully causing panic. Daybreak came gray and quiet. A thick fog curled off the river, blanketing the land. As the North readied for battle, dire wolves were heard howling. The men took it as a sign. Horns sounded the advance, muffled by the fog. Rickon's cavalry emerged from the mist, thundering forward. The Lannister scouts gave alarm, and soon the clash of steel echoed across the field. The northern archers loosed volleys that arced into the mist, guided only by the position of Lannister banners. Screams and shouts signaled the arrows found their mark. Rickon's riders hacked into the stunned southern ranks. But the Lannisters were not green recruits. These were seasoned soldiers who quickly formed shield walls and readied pikes. Men fell on both sides, the din of war rising to a crescendo. The plan to flank the enemy faltered when part of Meera's force became disoriented in the dense fog, slowed by uneven ground. The southern rearguard responded faster than expected, engaging the flankers in a chaotic melee. For a time, the battle hung in the balance, swirling in the soupy darkness. Ned, with the main northern body, advanced methodically, shield by shield, pushing the Lannisters back inch by inch. The air reeked of sweat, blood, and the wet stench of mud churned by boots and hooves. War cries mingled with dying screams, creating a tapestry of horror. Through it all, the gray dire wolf banners pressed on, unwavering. Rickon found himself face-to-face with Ser Jaime Lannister at last. The Kingslayer, his golden armor stained with mud and gore, swung his sword with lethal grace, parrying Rickon's initial strike. Sparks flew as steel met steel. Rickon gritted his teeth, the weight of House Stark's future on his shoulders. Their blades clashed again, echoing with a metallic shriek. Men fought and died around them, but in that instant it seemed the entire battlefield narrowed to the showdown between these two figures, the living legacy of Ned Stark's line and the famed Kingslayer from the south. Jaime moved with ruthless efficiency, each strike a test of Rickon's skill. The young Stark parried desperately, feeling the force behind every blow. He feigned an opening, trying to draw Jaime in. When Jaime lunged, Rickon pivoted, slashing at Jaime's flank. The blow might have ended him had Jaime not twisted aside at the last moment, receiving only a glancing wound. Blood darkened Jaime's armor. Snarling, he pressed forward, forcing Rickon onto his back foot. Rickon blocked a downward slash that sent a jolt through his entire arm. Summoning all his will, he kicked out, catching Jaime in the knee. The Kingslayer staggered, giving Rickon a moment to circle behind him. Their swords flashed again. Finally, Rickon saw an opening and thrust forward. His blade found Jaime's side, puncturing the armor's weaker joint. Jaime gasped, dropping to one knee. In that split second, Rickon could have ended the famed Kingslayer's life. He poised his sword for the fatal blow, panting, fury coursing through him. But he hesitated, remembering the lessons of honor his father had taught him. A Stark does not strike without reason, Ned had always said. A single stroke can carry the weight of an entire future. Jaime stared up at him, defiant even in defeat, blood seeping from his wound. For a moment, time froze, but the battlefield around them surged. Lannister knights rushed to protect Jaime, and Rickon was forced back by a shield bash. A swirl of bodies separated them. By the time Rickon regained his bearings, Jaime had been pulled away into a cluster of Lannister men retreating toward the rear. Rickon's breath came in ragged gasps, torn between relief and regret at not finishing it. Yet the battle pressed on. Elsewhere, Mira's flanking maneuver finally succeeded in collapsing one edge of the Lannister formation, sowing panic among the southern lines. Trumpets and horns signaled a retreat, and Jaime's force began to break. Some tried to flee across the river, only to be cut down or pulled under by heavy armor. Others surrendered on the spot, throwing down their arms. The northern victory was complete. The field was theirs. Cheers rose among the battered ranks of House Stark and its allies. Yet the cost was steep. Bodies littered the ground, both northern and southern. Rickon, blood-streaked but alive, turned a wide-eyed gaze over the carnage. He'd achieved a measure of revenge for all the Stark blood spilled in the south, but the sight of so many dead dampened any jubilation. War was not glorious. It was a dark necessity, one the North had chosen to endure for the sake of its independence. Ned Stark walked among the wounded, offering what comfort he could. He knew that news of this victory would resound through the Seven Kingdoms, proving that the North would not bow. The royal fleet, still at sea, would hear soon enough that their land-based allies had been shattered. It might persuade them to reconsider landing or force them to find another inlet. Perhaps this victory would bring the crown to the table at last, acknowledging the North as a realm unto itself. As crows wheeled overhead, feasting on the grim spoils, Ned paused by the banner of the dire wolf planted in the mud. He recalled the fables told by Old Nan, tales of the kings in the North who resisted the Undulls, who stood firm against the long night. In that moment, he felt their spirit flow through him. The North had indeed risen. It had refused to bend the knee to any king, forging its own destiny once more. Though the war might rage on, this triumph heralded a new chapter in the North's story, one of defiance, unity, and an unyielding will that not even the harshest winter could extinguish. In the days that followed, Ned worked to secure the prisoners, treat the wounded, and bury the dead with honor. Letters were dispatched to King's Landing, carrying both news of Jaime's defeat and a renewed offer: let the North stand as a free kingdom, or continue to bleed more men on these frozen fields. Perhaps reason would prevail, perhaps not. But with each passing day, more of the North's lords stood ready to defend their land. The once impossible dream, restoring the North's ancient independence, had come alive in the hearts of every man, woman, and child living above the neck. And so, in the gloom of a winter twilight, Ned Stark surveyed the aftermath, standing with his children by his side. They had come far from the tragedies that once befell them. They had lost dear family members, faced betrayals, endured unspeakable sorrows. Yet at this turning point, the Starks were forging a new legacy. The castle at Winterfell, centuries old, seemed to watch over them all with silent approval. Inside those halls, the memory of old kings lingered, whispering tales of the North's unbroken lineage. By refusing to bend the knee, House Stark had cast itself into a crucible from which it would either emerge stronger than ever or be annihilated. But looking into the unwavering eyes of his children, Ned believed wholeheartedly they would endure. Word spread through the winter winds, carried by travelers, merchants, and singers who passed along the story of House Stark's resolute stand. In taverns from the Wall down to the Riverlands, the ballads began to shift. Where once the South was seen as unstoppable, rumors of the Lannisters' defeat sparked hope that even the mightiest crowns could crack. Some whispered that another king in the North had risen, though none wore the title openly. Perhaps, in time, the North would crown a Stark once again, sealing its independence in the eyes of all Westeros. But for the moment, their simple declaration, "No kings but our own," was enough. In the hush of his tent on the battlefield, Ned allowed himself a moment of peace. He removed his gauntlets, flexing his fingers stiffened by cold and old scars. There was still much to do. The war might not be finished. Yet he felt the North spirit coursing through him like the chill wind, singing of home, of ages past, and of the fierce love they held for their land. They had taken the boldest step imaginable, and they would not turn back. The North was free again, in defiance of any who would claim lordship over it. Within Ned's heart, alongside the weight of responsibility, there grew a flicker of pride in having fulfilled the promise whispered by the ancient halls of Winterfell and the cold Godwood, a promise that the North would rise once more, unbowed, unconquered, and unbroken. And in the stillness, as he closed his eyes, he heard the voice of his beloved dead, the ancestors who walked the crypts below Winterfell, echoing across centuries. Their hushed refrain mingled with the wolf howls drifting through the darkened pines. The wolf does not kneel. We remember. We endure. We stand. Thus began the new age of northern independence, where snow and steel and the quiet, unshakable resolve of House Stark shaped the destiny of an entire land. And every winter wind that moaned across the battlements of Winterfell carried a single message across the North: we will not bend. We will not break. We are Starks, and this is our realm, now and forever. Ned Stark awoke to a gray dawn filtering through the canvas of his command tent. He had slept in his armor, sword close at hand, ready to rouse and fight at the first cry of alarm. His back ached, and his eyes felt gritty from too few hours of rest, but there was no time for indulgence. War seldom granted anyone the luxury of comfort. Outside, the muffled sounds of the northern camp awakening reached his ears, the scrape of steel being sharpened, the low murmur of voices, the churn of horses' hooves in muddy ground. A thin wind sighed across the encampment, carrying the scent of freshly dug graves which lay just beyond the field where the dead, northern and southern alike, had been carefully laid to rest. He rose from his cot and stepped into boots that had been caked with half-frozen mud from yesterday's battle. He paused, feeling the cold seep through the soles, remembering the screams and chaos that had erupted when the flanking maneuver finally broke the Lannister lines. He thought of Rickon's face streaked with dirt and blood, the wild light in his eyes as he fought Ser Jaime Lannister nearly to a standstill. It still amazed Ned how much his youngest son had grown, shaped by the tribulations that had battered House Stark time and again. At the tent's entrance, a tall guard gave Ned a respectful nod and moved aside to let him pass. The camp beyond was an organized sprawl of tents, supply wagons, and small cook fires. Snow had begun to fall lightly during the night, sprinkling the tents in a fine dust that threatened to turn the ground beneath them into a treacherous slurry. Men huddled around flames, warming stiff hands before gulping down thin porridge or chewing on crusts of bread. A few knights shared black humor about the southern captives locked in makeshift pens. Others kept silent, lost in the swirl of thoughts that come after surviving a bloody battle. Here, at the cusp of the White Knife River, House Stark had proven the strength of the North's resolve. They had not sought open warfare, but once the crown marched to subdue them, they had met force with force. The aftermath was a sobering victory. Ned and his lords now held the field, along with a number of Lannister prisoners. Many had died, but many more faced a stark choice: remain captive or swear never again to bear arms against the North. Some had accepted that vow, hoping for mercy. Moving through the slush, Ned soon reached the largest tent in the center of the camp. Inside, around a scarred wooden table, many of his key allies had already gathered. Sansa stood near the map, discussing supply lines with Davos Seaworth. Lord Wyman Manderley was seated on a stool, brushing snow off his thick cloak. Lady Mormont was speaking in hushed, urgent tones with Lord Glover, her eyes flashing with that unyielding Bear Island spirit. Mira Reed, mud still streaking her boots from the night's foray, stood quietly off to the side, face drawn with fatigue. The assembly quieted as Ned entered. He offered a small nod to acknowledge their presence, then walked to the table. A single lantern hung from a hook, illuminating the parchment map weighted down by iron daggers. The lines of the white knife were hastily sketched, along with rough depictions of the surrounding forests and hills. The route leading inland, where Jaime Lannister's main forces had collapsed or fled, was marked with small tokens representing cavalry units and foot soldiers. "We've had word from our scouts," Sansa said without preamble, her voice steady but laced with quiet urgency. "The remnants of Jaime's army have retreated west, likely trying to regroup or find a crossing. They left behind most of their heavy equipment. The Royal Fleet at sea has pulled back from White Harbor's Bay, though we're not certain why. Reports say they may be circling north, perhaps searching for another landing point or waiting for reinforcements from the southern coasts." Lord Manderley took this cue to speak. "My men spotted war galleys headed northward toward the rocky shores beyond Skagos. If they hope to land there, the seas will punish them. The currents are fierce and the storms are worse. They'd be inviting disaster. Still, these southerners know little of our waters, and underestimating the north is a common failing of the Iron Throne." Lady Mormont agreed with a curt nod. "And if they do land anywhere near Bear Island, they'll face more than storms. We'll give them a greeting they'll never forget." Davos, his hair more salted with gray than before, cleared his throat. "We must remain vigilant, my lords and ladies. This victory, sweet though it is, might tempt us to complacency. The Crown can still rally more southern houses, maybe even the Tyrells or the Stormlands if they think it'll preserve their favor at court. We have to plan for a drawn-out conflict unless the Crown sues for peace." Ned set both hands on the table and looked at each face in turn. "Has there been any reply from King's Landing regarding our terms? We sent ravens after the battle, urging them again to recognize the North's independence in exchange for peace." Sansa's eyes flicked toward a pair of scrolls on the table, their wax seals already broken. "A new letter arrived this morning. The small council wrote that the King, Tommen, demands we release our prisoners unconditionally and renew our oaths of fealty. They warn that if we do not, they'll unleash further armies, that their might is unassailable. It's the same threat, worded differently. There's also a missive from Cersei Lannister, though it's more rant than negotiation. She accuses us of treason and swears we'll face the dragon's wrath soon. I'm not certain what she means by that." Silence hung in the tent. Lady Mormont sneered. "Dragons are long gone, last we checked." Ned exhaled through his nose, his jaw tightening. "They rely on intimidation. Perhaps they think rumors of Daenerys Targaryen across the narrow sea can be leveraged in some fashion. Or they simply threaten us with the memory of Dragonfire to reignite old fears. Regardless, it changes nothing. We hold firm." He gazed at each of his allies, ensuring their determination remained. No one flinched. They had come too far, had lost too many to surrender now. The North had bled in wars orchestrated by Southern politics for generations. This stance, though bold, was their chance to carve out a future under their own rule. "There's more," Davos added, looking uneasy. "My sources in the ports, friends of mine, old sailors, mention that certain Sells-word companies have been sighted in ports along the Narrow Sea. Companies with reputations for brutality. The Crown may be hiring mercenaries to bolster their ranks. If that's so, we could see thousands more swords by spring." That prospect cast a pall over the group. Mercenaries had no loyalty except to gold, and the Lannisters were rumored to have near-limitless resources hidden away in Casterly Rock. If entire Sells-word companies landed in Westeros, they wouldn't be as vulnerable to northern winters as a typical southern host. They might be better trained for harsh conditions, especially if they hailed from certain corners of Essos. Rickon entered the tent then, his steps loud in the hush, still wearing the battered leathers from yesterday. His forearm was wrapped in fresh bandages from a cut sustained during his duel with Jaime. Determination sparkled in his gray eyes. "Father," he said, dipping his head respectfully. "Our patrols report some Lannister riders creeping through the forests to the west, likely trying to locate stragglers or carry messages. I've sent men to intercept, but you should know they're out there." Ned pressed his lips into a line. "We'll need to keep pressing to ensure Jaime can't regroup effectively. But we must also return to Winterfell soon. This field is no place for a protracted stand, especially if more snow is coming. We've achieved a major victory here, but if the Crown finds a way around us, we could be outflanked." Lady Mormont crossed her arms over her chest. "Then let's go for the throat, Lord Stark. Let's hunt down what remains of Jaime's forces, scatter them, and drive them back across the neck. Show the crown that stepping onto northern soil again is a death sentence. Rickon stepped forward. I want to finish what we started. Let me lead a force west to chase Jaime down before he has a chance to link up with reinforcements. Or to corner him if he tries a different path. He's wounded. We can strike while he's vulnerable. Sansa shook her head slightly. We have to be careful. If we spread ourselves too thin, we risk defeat in detail. The Southern Fleet isn't gone, it may try another landing. And if a second Southern army pushes north while we chase Jaime, we could be caught in the open. Our best defensive position is Winterfell itself, with supply lines behind our walls. Ned listened carefully, weighing every word. He had always valued his children's counsel, though each approached the situation from different angles. Rickon, emboldened by victory, wanted swift and lethal action. Sansa, bearing the scars of Southern intrigues, wanted to consolidate and protect their stronghold. Davos, practical and cautious, likely saw merit in both arguments. The rest of the lords showed a mix of readiness for war and fear of overreach. Finally, Ned spoke. We'll split our forces. A contingent of cavalry will ride west under Rickon's command to disrupt any attempt by Jaime to regroup. Do not engage in a pitched battle if his men are too numerous. Hit and run. Harass them. The rest of us will withdraw to Winterfell as planned. We'll prepare the castle for a prolonged siege if it comes to that. Lady Mormont, I'd ask you to remain with the main force and help anchor our defenses when we return home. The Bear Island Lord rose half out of her seat, eyes blazing with the passion her house was known for. But she nodded once. As you command, Lord Stark. So it was decided. Over the next few hours, horns rang through the camp, signaling the reorganization. Men hurried to dismantle tents and load wagons. Thick clouds overhead promised more snow by nightfall, so the order was given to move at once. Northern infantry formed ranks, banners of the dire wolf and other houses fluttering in the cold wind. The wounded were placed on wagons or makeshift litters. Captured Southern knights, sullen and exhausted, were tied in pairs and marched under guard, though some who had sworn not to raise arms again were allowed to help with menial tasks. Rickon selected a few hundred seasoned riders, drawn from the Umbers, the Serwins, and a handful from House Manderley who were skilled with lances and bows. Among them, a corps of Stark retainers would ensure discipline. Before setting off, Rickon approached Ned one final time outside the command tent. He bowed his head briefly, then looked his father in the eye. I won't fail you, Rickon said. Jaime will regret ever stepping foot in the north. Ned placed a gloved hand on his son's shoulder. Your courage does us credit. But remember, do not let your anger get the better of you. War is about strategy as much as skill with steel. Return to us in one piece, Rickon. Rickon managed a lopsided grin. I will. They clasped forearms, a brief moment of father and son solidarity that reminded Ned of how young Rickon still was, no matter how fiercely he carried himself. In another life, Rickon might have grown up carefree within the walls of Winterfell, chasing dire wolf pups, playing pranks with his siblings. War had cut that childhood short. In minutes, the cavalry detachment rode west, their breath steaming in the cold air, hoofs thundering across the trampled snow. Ned watched them depart, a knot of worry in his chest. Then he turned to rejoin the main column as it began its march north, trudging back to Winterfell. Scouts fanned out on either flank, ensuring no hidden enemy lurked near the road. Wagons creaked, accompanied by the rhythmic stomp of boots. The mood among the marching soldiers was subdued, yet not without a certain grim pride. They had faced the Lannisters and prevailed. The journey back took longer than expected as the clouds overhead unleashed a steady, wind-blown snowfall. Visibility shrank, even the fur-lined hoods the men wore were soon crusted in ice. Sections of road turned to slush, then froze again by night, making every step treacherous. Still, they pressed on. Occasionally, they passed deserted villages where local folk had heard of the fighting and fled to hidden crofts. At each stop, Ned sent out riders with word that the North's army was passing in peace, that their fight was with the South, not with their own. 3 days later, the familiar sight of Winterfell's gray walls emerged from a swirl of snow. Despite the inclement weather, watchmen on the battlements sounded a horn of welcome. Wordless relief washed through Ned's ranks at the prospect of warmth, shelter, and a roof overhead. When they clattered across the drawbridge and into the castle yard, they were greeted by stable hands, stewards, and healers who rushed forward to take in the wounded. The great hall flickered with fresh fires. Trestle tables were hastily erected and hot meals prepared. Sansa oversaw the distribution of bread, ale, and mead, ensuring every man received something to ease the weariness of the march. Ned dismounted with a wince of pain. His old scars protested the cold and the strain of weeks in the field. Maester Wolken hurried to his side, asking after his injuries and whether he required a poultice. Ned waved the maester away for the moment. "See to the men first, maester. I can manage." Deep in his bones, he felt the heaviness of command. But even as he dragged himself across the yard, he found a sense of renewed hope. Winterfell was more than stone and mortar, it was the heart of the North, pulsing with ancient memories. The feeling of returning to those protective walls, especially after the horrors of battle, was almost spiritual. Days slid into a quiet pattern of recovery. The great hall bustled with the daily demands of feeding, healing, and reorganizing. Scouts brought news of the Crown's next moves. A few outriders reported that the Southern Fleet had indeed drifted far north, possibly searching for a better harbor. Others believe the fleet had retreated entirely for fear of storms. Jaime Lannister's scattered forces had fled south of the Neck or vanished into the forests. Rickon's cavalry detachment had sent a single raven confirming minor skirmishes, but no decisive clash yet. The final line of Rickon's missive stated that he would continue searching for Jaime, letting no opportunity slip by. Bran remained within Winterfell, quietly observing. He spent long hours in the Godswood, communing with the Weirwood. Ned would catch glimpses of his son in the courtyard or along the ramparts, his expression distant, as though seeing beyond the present. Sometimes Sansa joined Bran in the Godswood, and they would speak in hushed tones. Whatever Bran saw in his visions, he kept it to himself unless he felt it vital to share. The war had changed him more than any of them truly understood. He seemed to bear an entire world of knowledge behind his calm eyes, knowledge gleaned from the old gods and the ancient heart tree. One evening, Ned stood in the tower room that overlooked Winterfell's courtyard. Snow fell thick outside, blurring the edges of the battlements. Within the soft glow of candlelight, he pored over the letters spread across a small table. One carried the seal of the Vale. Lord Yohn Royce wrote that the Vale remained officially allied to the throne, but was in no hurry to commit forces against the North. Another letter, from a minor house in the Riverlands, hinted they might quietly block Lannister supplies on their roads, though they stopped short of open defiance. A third note arrived from the Iron Islands, couched in typically blunt language, suggesting that the Ironborn might be persuaded to raid the Lannisters' western shores, if the North were willing to look the other way or offer some concession. Ned felt his stomach twist at the idea of encouraging Ironborn raids, given their history of pillaging and cruelty. Still, if it kept Southern armies pinned down, perhaps it was worth exploring. At last, Ned moved aside the letters and ran a hand over his tired face. The responsibilities weighed on him, yet he stood resolute. The North had made its choice, and if forging a free kingdom required unconventional alliances, so be it. After a moment, a knock sounded at the door. Sansa entered, her cloak damp from the weather. She carried another scroll, sealed in wax but unmarked by sigil. "This came by Raven, father?" she said softly, extending the parchment. "It's from Rickon." Ned broke the seal and scanned the words, his eyes narrowing. "They've located Jaime Lannister's main encampment, near the ruins of an old holdfast west of the King's Road, close to a small lake. Rickon scouts say it's well defended, but not impossible to storm if done carefully. Jaime's gathering stragglers, but they're still weakened. Is Rickon planning to attack?" "He asks for reinforcements," Ned answered, exhaling. "He believes he can smash what's left of the Lannister host if he hits them hard, but he's rightly cautious. Jaime may be preparing a trap. He's a cunning commander." Sansa moved closer, concern etched in her face. "If we send too many men, we weaken Winterfell. If we send too few, Rickon might be overwhelmed. The Southern Crown could also be mustering another army for the spring. This is a delicate balance." Ned weighed the risk carefully. Allowing Jaime Lannister to remain at large in the North was risky. He could harass villages, plunder resources, or serve as a beacon for fresh Southern troops if they arrived. Yet sending a large force westward into uncertain territory might open Winterfell to a sudden, bold strike from another quarter. He needed to make a choice that would serve the long-term interests of the North, not just the short-term. "We'll send a swift but strong force," Ned decided. "Lord Glover can lead alongside a battalion of archers and footmen. That, combined with Rickon's cavalry, should be enough to corner Jaime. We still hold a defensive advantage here at Winterfell with the forces we have left, and the castle walls can withstand any hasty attack." Sansa, please see to the logistics, food, tents, mounts for the reinforcements. She nodded. Right away, father. After Sansa left, Ned stood by the window again, gazing out over the snowy courtyard. His breath fogged the chilled glass. He remembered a time when Winterfell was a haven of peace for him. He could almost see his children as youngsters chasing each other around the yard, shouting and laughing. The memory felt distant from another life before war had taken so much. Now, Winterfell was a fortress at war, and his children were its guardians as much as he was. Within 2 days, Lord Glover's contingent was ready. They set out at dawn, banners snapping in the breeze. Glover himself rode at the forefront on a sturdy warhorse, accompanied by a mix of stalwart northern soldiers armed with axes and spears. In their train followed wagons of provisions, a mobile smithy, and healers prepared to deal with the aftermath of another clash. Ned and Sansa stood on the ramparts, watching them depart into the swirling snow. The gates closed once the last horse disappeared into the whiteness. And so another tense vigil began at Winterfell. Snow continued falling for days, cloaking the courtyards in white silence. Mira Reed led hunting parties to keep fresh meat in their stores. Lady Mormont drilled her warriors, insisting they remain sharp. Every day, ravens arrived with tidings from Rickon, each message shorter than the last. They approached Jaime's encampment, scouted the lakeside, and tested the outer defenses. Skirmishes erupted between outriders. The final raven Ned received simply read, "We make our move tomorrow at dawn." Then no word for 2 days. Anxiety weighed heavily on Winterfell. The men and women tried to go about their duties, but the tension was palpable. Sansa threw herself into reorganizing storerooms, seeing personally to every detail of the castle's winter supplies. Bran drifted between his tower and the Godwood, eyes haunted by whatever visions the Heart Tree granted him. Ned walked the ramparts at night, gazing out into the vast emptiness of the northern sky, each star seeming both remote and ominous. He caught glimpses of a great gray dire wolf prowling beyond the walls, a silent sentinel in the darkness. Perhaps it was just a half-remembered echo of Ghost, Jon's companion in another life, or maybe a living ghost returned to keep watch over the Starks. Either way, Ned felt oddly comforted by its presence. Finally, in the small hours before dawn on the 3rd day, shouts rose near the main gate. A rider approached, half-frozen, bearing a scroll sealed with Rickon's personal sign. Ned rushed down with a guard to greet the messenger. The man nearly toppled from his saddle, drained from riding all night through the thickening snowdrifts. He managed to press the scroll into Ned's hands before being helped away for warmth and food. Ned hurried back inside, broke the seal, and read by flickering torchlight. The words were scrawled, the ink spattered, but the message was clear: victory. Rickon and Lord Glover had stormed Jaime's encampment at dawn, taking the Lannisters by surprise. Though the fighting had been fierce, the northern forces prevailed. Jaime's standard had fallen. Many Southerners were captured or killed, and the rest fled into the wilderness, leaderless and scattered. Rickon wrote that Jaime Lannister himself was unaccounted for. No one could confirm if he had been slain or escaped. But the threat was crushed. The letter closed with a triumphant note urging Ned not to worry. Relief flooded Ned, washing away tension he hadn't fully acknowledged. The men-at-arms who guarded him in the corridor saw the change in his expression. One ventured a hopeful question. "Good news, M-Lord?" Ned allowed himself the smallest of smiles. "The best we could hope for under the circumstances." By midday, the news was shared throughout Winterfell. House Stark had broken the last of Jaime's forces. Cheers filled the great hall, echoing across the courtyard. At the gates, direwolf banners were lifted high in celebration. Soldiers exchanged hearty backslaps, some sinking to their knees in thanks to the old gods for deliverance. Sansa directed the kitchen staff to prepare a feast of whatever hearty fare they could muster: roast meat, fresh bread, vegetables pickled in brine. Mead and ale were rationed out, enough for each man to drink a toast without depleting the castle's stores. For the first time in weeks, laughter rang in the corridors. Yet in the midst of the jubilation, Ned's mind drifted to the question, where was Jaime Lannister? If he truly escaped, he would carry news of his defeat back to King's Landing or to any southern lords who might still think to press the attack. That knowledge could either discourage the crown or spur them to greater fury. Either way, the war was not over until the Iron Throne recognized the North's independence. Still, the victory brought them closer to that goal. The North had proven time and again it would not be conquered. When Rickon finally returned, it was nearly a week later. He led a small vanguard that straggled in through Winterfell's main gate, weary but triumphant. Rickon's armor bore fresh dents, and a bandage wrapped his left shoulder. Behind him marched rows of prisoners, those who had been captured during the battle or in subsequent chases through the woods. Among them were several highborn knights, their fancy plate armor scuffed and scarred. Lord Glover rode beside Rickon, face grim with the memory of men lost, but equally resolute. Ned came down to meet them in the courtyard, flanked by Sansa, Davos, and Lady Mormont. Snow fell around them as Rickon dismounted, wincing slightly from his wound. He extended a hand to clasp Ned's. "We did it, father," Rickon said, voice raspy with exhaustion. "We found them at dawn, just as planned. Jaime's men fought like cornered animals, but we gave them no quarter. There were heavy losses on both sides, though. Glover will have the final numbers." Lord Glover inclined his head. "We lost near 200 men, all told. They will be mourned. But we captured or killed most of the Lannister host. Some tried to flee south, though we had outriders waiting. Jaime's own pavilion was found empty. We found traces of blood, so perhaps he was wounded more severely than before." Ned's gaze swept over the new prisoners, many of whom stared at the snow as if they could not believe their predicament. "Take them to the cells below and see they're treated fairly," he ordered. "We are not butchers. We'll question them and see if they'll swear not to raise arms against us again." Rickon nodded, passing the responsibility to his sergeants. Then he rubbed a hand over his eyes. "I need rest." Sansa stepped forward, gently placing a hand on Rickon's uninjured arm. "You look ready to collapse. Come, there's hot food and a fire waiting." As Rickon let himself be led toward the great hall, Ned's gaze lingered on the stark image of the prisoners. They trudged forward in chains, heads bowed, battered by the cold. The North took no pleasure in cruelty. But these men had come to subjugate them, to seize by force what House Stark had rightfully declared free. War made no allowances for sentiment, it demanded choices, often harsh ones. That evening, the great hall was filled with subdued celebration. The high table had places for Rickon, Glover, Mormont, and the other commanding lords who had led the victory. Women poured ale and cider, while stewards brought roasted vegetables, fish from the White Knife, and warm bread. The wounded were tended in side chambers by healers. Lantern light danced on the stone walls, illuminating the storied banners of House Stark. Between mouthfuls of stew, Rickon recounted more details of the battle. He told how Jaime's knights tried to mount a countercharge, but the northern archers had rained arrows that killed horses and men alike, shattering their momentum. "Even so," Rickon said, "I never saw Jaime himself. None of our men did, really, not alive anyway. If he's out there somewhere, he's on the run." Ned watched Rickon carefully, sensing the undertone of disappointment. Rickon had nearly killed Jaime once. Their unfinished duel clearly weighed on him. "You did well," Ned said quietly. "Remember, you're fighting for the North's future, not just personal vengeance." Rickon accepted the words with a solemn nod. "I haven't forgotten." Lord Glover cleared his throat. "This victory won't go unnoticed in King's Landing. They'll send more ravens filled with threats or try another approach entirely. We must be ready." Sansa glanced at Ned. "We should formalize our alliances further. The Vale, the Riverlands, maybe even Dorne. If the Crown continues this war, they'll be looking for ways to isolate us." Ned tapped his fingers on the table. "You've the right of it, Sansa. Tomorrow, we'll draft letters to every great house, declaring again our willingness to maintain peace, provided they acknowledge our sovereignty." He paused, letting the weight of that statement settle on everyone present. "We do not wish for endless war, but if the Crown forces our hand, we will fight." That night, after the hall emptied and the fires burned low, Ned visited the Godwood. The snow-laden branches glimmered beneath the half-moon. In the center of the sacred grove stood the ancient weirwood, its face carved and stained red with sap. Ned walked across the icy ground, inhaling the crisp air. The hush of the place felt like a world apart from the violence and chaos of war. He knelt by the still pool, gazing into his own wavering reflection. "I ask your guidance," he murmured to the old gods. "We've defended ourselves and our people, yet bloodshed seems unending. I would see the North flourish, free from the South's demands. If that is the path you will, give me the strength to see it through." A faint rustling of branches answered him, perhaps stirred by the slightest breeze. He thought he glimpsed movement in the tree's crimson eyes, but it might have been the play of moonlight. Either way, the presence in the Godwood felt neither angry nor forbidding, rather, it was watchful, as if the ancient spirits weighed his words against the tapestry of history. He remained there for a while, letting the cold bite into his cloak and numb his hands until he finally rose and returned indoors. In the days that followed, the North took careful stock of its position. Scattered warbands from the south still roamed near the neck, but none seemed eager to push deeper into hostile territory without firm support. The main threat of Jaime's host was ended. One small comfort was the winter thickening across the region. Traveling even short distances became a trial, and for any southern army and used to such conditions, the land itself was a foe. Sansa penned letters day and night, appealing to or bargaining with houses outside the crown's most steadfast circle. Lords from the Westerlands might appreciate fewer raids if Lannister influence waned. Lords from the Reach might prefer to keep their harvests for themselves rather than sending them to support a fruitless war in the frozen north. Bit by bit, House Stark sought to turn the political tide. Rickon took to patrolling the countryside around Winterfell with a small band of loyal riders. He had grown restless, wanting to ensure no stragglers threatened the smallfolk. Sometimes he returned at dusk with a half-frozen prisoner or a stray horse rescued from the wild. The keep's quiet routine was ill-suited to a youth whose blood still burned with the adrenaline of battle. Ned reminded him that discipline was as crucial as courage, and Rickon accepted this with a sense of duty, albeit one couched in impatience for the next test of arms. Bran rarely joined in these war councils. He seemed too absorbed in his own realm of visions and dreams. One night, however, as Ned was finishing a discussion with Davos in the Solar, Bran appeared at the threshold. His gaze was distant, and for a moment Ned wondered if his son was fully present. Then Bran said, "Father, the sea roars louder in my dreams. I see sails with golden roses, drifting north in the storms. I see shapes in the sky, wings of black and red." He paused, his voice trembling. "Be prepared. Fire and blood are not just words." Ned exchanged a puzzled glance with Davos. "Golden roses suggest the Tyrells," Davos ventured. "If they're sending ships, that would imply the Reach is formally joining the Crown's war effort." Bran's expression remained solemn. "I saw more. A shadow across the sea, something ancient stirring. This conflict is bigger than just the Crown and the North. The old gods stir uneasily. War begets war." Though the prophecy was cryptic, Ned took it seriously. The Tyrells had a powerful navy and vast resources. If they sailed north, they might aim for White Harbor or attempt to bypass the typical coastal routes. And what of the mention of black and red wings in the sky? The Targaryen colors. Rumors persisted of Daenerys Targaryen across the Narrow Sea, though the shape that Bran spoke of could be something else entirely. War had a way of awakening old powers, and the notion unsettled Ned more than he wished to show. He thanked Bran for sharing this vision and promised to remain vigilant. Bran bowed his head and departed as silently as he had come. Davos folded his arms, brow furrowed. "We'll have to consider that the Tyrells might be preparing a fleet for war. At least winter still holds the seas in its grip. Any crossing will be perilous." Ned agreed, though he didn't find the prospect reassuring. The Tyrells had avoided direct entanglement in the War of the Five Kings until late, always playing both sides for maximum advantage. They were not to be underestimated, and if they decided to send ships or men to support the Crown's cause, the North might face a fresh front in the months ahead. A week later, those fears solidified when a raven arrived from a trader in the Stepstones, carrying a terse report. Multiple Tyrell ships flying the Rose Banner had indeed sailed from the ports near Old Town, rumored to be bound for King's Landing or the northern coasts. The timeline for their arrival was uncertain, but the intention was clear enough. Ned summoned his closest advisors to discuss the implications. The Great Hall once again became a place of intense debate, with Lady Mormont calling for immediate action to reinforce White Harbor, Davos cautioning that they had to confirm the route of the Tyrell vessels, and Sansa suggesting new letters be dispatched to attempt to dissuade the Tyrell leadership. Meanwhile, the letters to King's Landing demanding recognition of the North's independence remained unanswered, or answered only by more vague threats. Tommen Baratheon's council seemed bent on reasserting control, no matter the cost in gold or lives. Cersei Lannister's personal messages grew more vitriolic, insisting that once winter broke, the Crown's retribution would be swift and terrible. None of it surprised Ned. The Lannisters had never forgiven House Stark for defying them in the capital long ago. If anything, the passage of time only deepened that hostility. Days turned into weeks, and winter's hold on the land tightened. Supplies at Winterfell remained stable, but with more men than ever quartered inside, rationing became stricter. Nightfall brought sub-zero temperatures that threatened to freeze the wells. Blacksmiths worked in the bitter cold to keep weapons in repair, forging arrowheads and mending armor. Sansa coordinated her stewards to keep morale high. Small amusements on feast days, extra. Servings of stew, small gifts of spiced wine for the frontline sentries. Everyone sensed they were living in the eye of a storm, preparing for whatever the Crown tried next. The tension broke in dramatic fashion when, late one afternoon, A column of riders was spotted approaching from the west, carrying no banners. Winterfell's sentries raised the alarm. Ned and Lady Mormont rushed to the walls. Below, in the swirling snow, men on horseback formed a tense semicircle near the gate. They carried swords and spears at the ready. One among them, a knight with a black cloak, raised his visor and called out that he came with a message for the Lord of Winterfell. Ned descended, accompanied by a handful of trusted guards. He ordered the gates opened cautiously, archers standing by. The riders entered under watchful eyes. Their leader dismounted, revealing a face lined with worry and exhaustion. His arms bore no identifying crest. He bowed stiffly before Ned. "I am Ser Reginald Tarly," he said, voice rough from the cold. "Sworn sword to House Tarly of the Reach. I bear a letter from Lady Olenna Tyrell herself, the Queen of Thorns." At the mention of Olenna Tyrell, Lady Mormont raised an eyebrow. Ned's mind raced. Olenna was a formidable political mind, known for her cunning and sharp wit. The presence of a Tarly knight as an envoy was curious. House Tarly was sworn to the Tyrells, but Randall Tarly had once marched with the crown. Perhaps the friction within the Reach had shifted. "Give me the letter," Ned said politely. Ser Reginald handed over a rolled parchment. Ned broke the Tyrell seal, unrolling the paper in the cold wind. He read swiftly, eyes narrowing. Olenna Tyrell's words were laced with her characteristic sarcasm. "Lord Stark, I write from a position one might call precarious. My dear grandchildren have, as usual, embroiled us in one scheme or another. The crown demands our ships and our gold. Certain ambitious members of my family see a chance to ingratiate themselves at court. Yet others, myself included, wonder if pouring men and resources into a war against the North is wise or necessary, especially when that war seems so unwinnable in the dead of winter. I am no friend to Lannisters. I know your family's grievances. I also know you've proven more than capable of defending your land. Is the North prepared to offer terms beneficial to the Reach? Should we decline to assist the Crown in further hostilities? The Tyrell name is valuable. Many consider our alliance a key to controlling half the realm's food supply. Make it worth our while to remain neutral, shall we say, and you may find fewer Tyrell ships sailing your way. I do not make idle threats, nor do I offer idle friendship. Choose your next step carefully. My messenger will return with your answer. Olenna of House Tyrell." Ned read it twice, absorbing the veiled message. Olenna was hinting that the Tyrells might back out of the Crown's war if the North provided sufficient incentive or guarantees. She dangled the prospect of neutrality if not outright support. This presented a chance to avoid a new front opening against them, perhaps even a path toward isolating King's Landing. But the cost might be high. The Tyrells would not do this out of generosity. He folded the letter, turning to Lady Mormont. "It seems the Tyrell matriarch wishes to bargain." Mormont frowned. "Bargain or extort? They're opportunists, all of them." Davos and Sansa arrived then, having heard the commotion. Ned passed them the letter, letting them read for themselves. Davos grunted. "We could keep them neutral if we promise certain trade concessions once we're free. Grain, shipping rights at White Harbor, maybe. But if we promise them too much, we risk the self-sufficiency of the North." Sansa looked thoughtful. "Still, this might be our best chance to prevent a Tyrell fleet from joining the Crown. One less enemy to worry about." Ser Reginald stood quietly, covered in a sheen of frost. Ned turned to him. "You've come a long way. You must rest and eat before returning. We'll consider Lady Olenna's words carefully." The knight dipped his head, relief showing in his eyes. "Thank you, Lord Stark." They provided him and his escort with what hospitality Winterfell could spare. Ser Reginald retired to a guest chamber, leaving Ned and his council to discuss. The assembled northern lords in the Great Hall expressed mixed opinions. Some felt the Tyrells should be spurned as snakes who had turned coat many times before. Others argued that forging a secret pact with them might be the difference between survival and a protracted war. Sansa noted that if the Tyrells remained neutral or outright supportive of the North, other southern houses might follow suit or at least hesitate to fight for a losing cause. Ned decided they would draft a reply that evening. He asked Sansa and Davos to help him shape the wording so it was both firm and enticing. They would offer trade privileges in the port of White Harbor once independence was recognized, as well as favorable terms for the exchange of certain northern resources, timber, furs, in return for southern produce in times of poor harvest. In essence, the letter would propose a commercial alliance, requesting that the Tyrells stand aside if the crown demanded their ships. It was a gamble. Olenna might see it as insufficient, or she might accept. But it was a far better option than facing the Reach's might. 2 days later, Ser Reginald Tarly departed Winterfell with the sealed reply. Snow had eased, and though the cold remained fierce, the roads were marginally passable. Before leaving, he confided to Ned that certain factions within the Reach were impatient with the Lannisters' endless demands. War drains gold faster than a sieve leaks water, he said. Many Tyrell bannermen see no profit in freezing in the north for the sake of Cersei Lannister's vengeance. Ned listened impassively, though inwardly he recognized that this might be the break they needed. Once Tarly was gone, the castle settled again into its daily routine of watches, drills, and strategic planning. The gloom of winter pressed down, but a small spark of optimism glowed in each heart. Maybe there was a way out of this bloodshed that didn't require yet another pitched battle. Not long after, a rider from the Neck arrived, breathless with news. The man had seen a group of Lannister survivors, fewer than 24, struggling southward through the mire, led by a figure with golden hair. He claimed it was Jaime Lannister himself, half dead from hunger and cold, heading south with whatever loyal men he had left. The rumor sent a ripple through Winterfell. Rickon wanted to mount a pursuit at once, but Ned counseled caution. He's leaving the north of his own accord. That spares us the trouble of hunting him down. Rickon grumbled but obeyed. In a sense, Ned felt a pang of relief. If Jaime truly departed, the North wouldn't need to slay him or risk him organizing more resistance within their borders. The Crown's champion had been beaten back, a testament to how fiercely the North defended its claim to independence. As the days crawled by, the watchers on the walls kept their eyes trained south, east, and west, expecting at any moment to spot foreign sails or enemy banners. But none came. Only the swirling of snow and the endless hush of winter nights. The quiet made some uneasy. Others took the calm as a blessing, a chance for respite after the recent battles. Scouts occasionally discovered the remains of Lannister or Crown soldiers frozen in the drifts, too weak or wounded to survive. No large force dared test the North again, not in the heart of winter. And so, incrementally, the North reclaimed a kind of rhythm, neither wholly at peace nor consumed by war. Within Winterfell, they prepared for every possibility. Archers practiced daily, forging arrowheads and stockpiling quivers. Armorers hammered away, building up an arsenal of newly forged steel. Masons strengthened the battlements, installing new catapults atop the outer walls. Supplies were rationed carefully. Letters continued to flow out to lords great and small, urging them to recognize the North's independence or at least remain neutral. Davos coordinated a web of communication by Raven, gleaning what news he could from every corner of Westeros. Then, late one freezing evening, a Raven arrived bearing a small scroll with a Tyrell seal. The messenger who brought it to Ned wore a grave expression. Ned carried the scroll to the solar where Sansa and Davos awaited. He hesitated a moment, then broke the wax. His eyes moved across the page, lips forming silent words. Lord Stark, your proposal intrigues me. The Crown demands we send ships north in spring. I am not so inclined to waste Tyrell resources. That said, many in my family still cling to the notion of Lannister alliances. Therefore, I will require assurances beyond the trade privileges you offered. Specifically, I want a more direct partnership with the North, perhaps through mutual pledges of defense or betrothals that seal our houses in amity. If you find this amenable, I will ensure the Tyrell fleets remain in our harbors and do not set sail against you. Otherwise, my hands may be forced by more impetuous branches of my family. Send your response promptly. We do not have the luxury of endless waiting. Olenna of House Tyrell. Sansa let out a soft breath when she finished reading the letter. She wants a marriage alliance, she said quietly. Or something akin to it. The Tyrells want to bind us in a way that ensures loyalty so the Crown can't later pry them away. Davos scratched his beard. A bold move. We have Rickon, who is not yet wed. Or we could propose some other arrangement. But it's risky. The North has always been wary of tying itself too closely to southern houses, especially after what happened with the Tullis and Lannisters. Ned considered the letter's implications. Olenna Tyrell was cunning, and she saw an opportunity. The North needed allies, the Tyrells wanted a reason to avoid war. A betrothal or formal alliance could tilt the balance of power. Yet the North risked repeating past mistakes, entangling itself in southern politics, inviting infiltration or future betrayals. Still, refusing might mean facing the full might of the Tyrell navy come spring. He sighed. We must consider it. If the Tyrells truly hold back their forces, that might be enough to force the crown to negotiate or at least fight alone. Without the Tyrell ships and gold, the Lannisters will be severely hampered. Sansa nodded. We should involve Rickon in this discussion. It affects him most directly. And so, the next day, Ned convened a small council in the Solar. Sansa, Rickon, Davos, Lady Mormont, and Lord Glover, who had returned from a final sweep of the Western Plains. Bran was invited, though he lingered quietly by the window, seldom speaking. Ned read Olenna's latest missive aloud. The mood turned pensive. I do not trust the Tyrells, Lady Mormont declared, her tone fierce. But I see the advantage of forging a compact that prevents them from stabbing us in the back. If a marriage is the cost, it might save countless lives. Rickon frowned, crossing his arms. I won't lie, I'm not eager to marry someone I've never met just to seal a political deal. But if it helps the North stand on its own, so be it. I owe that much to everyone who's bled for us. Sansa reached out to place a hand on her brother's arm. It would be a great sacrifice, Rickon, but sometimes we must do difficult things for the good of our people. Davos studied Rickon. You're certain? Rickon offered a grim smile. As certain as I can be of anything in these times. Ned closed his eyes briefly, recalling his own experience being married to Catelyn Tully for the sake of alliances. That union had grown into love, but it hadn't started that way. He felt a pang of sadness that Rickon might be thrust into a similarly cold arrangement. Yet he also knew that war demanded such decisions. Then Bran spoke from his seat by the window, his voice distant. The future twists in many ways. Sometimes forging a bond with flowers spares us from the thorns that would pierce our hearts. Sometimes it invites a new kind of wound. Yet I see in the leaves a path where steel and winter's chill need not drown the world in blood. They considered Bran's cryptic words. Ned nodded. We'll proceed carefully. If we can formalize an alliance with House Tyrell that guarantees they stay out of the war, that could break the crown's momentum. The conditions must protect the North's sovereignty above all. They drafted a measured response. In it, Ned expressed willingness to discuss a formal alliance, including a possible betrothal between Rickon Stark and a suitable Tyrell match on the condition that the Tyrell fleet remain in port and no gold flow to King's Landing for the war effort. Further, the North would only proceed once the Tyrells gave public or at least unequivocal notice that they refused to wage war on House Stark. The letter ended with an invitation for Tyrell envoys to visit Winterfell under a flag of truce to finalize terms. Better to speak face-to-face than rely on ravens alone. 2 days later, their ravens departed into the snowy sky, bound for Highgarden and Old Town. Winter's hush again descended on the castle as they waited. In the interim, life at Winterfell returned to its new normal: watch rotations, archery practice, foraging expeditions. Mira Reed and her brother, Jojen, once they arrived from Greywater Watch, continued to offer crucial intelligence from the swamps of the Neck, ensuring no southern army slipped through. Lord Glover and Lady Mormont rotated their troops in and out of Winterfell, letting weary fighters go home for brief respite while fresh levies stood guard. A sense of cautious optimism took hold. Men began to speak of the war as though it might soon end. Sansa pressed for every household loyal to the Starks to prepare for spring planting as usual so that the North wouldn't face famine even if the war dragged on. Davos set about reorganizing trade routes. Captured Lannister knights languished in cells unless they swore never again to bear arms against the North. Some pledged that oath, others refused out of pride. Rickon, for his part, rode frequent patrols, returning each night more restless, as if bracing for a threat that never fully materialized. Then, one frosty afternoon, horns sounded from Winterfell's walls. A small party approached, banners furled to keep them from being tattered by the wind. When the visitors drew closer, the watchers recognized the sigil of Highgarden. The golden rose embroidered on a dark green standard. The Tyrell envoys had come. A single carriage, accompanied by half a dozen riders, trundled through the snow, forging a path toward Winterfell's gate. Ned felt a curious mix of trepidation and relief. If these envoys arrived in good faith, it might herald an end to the immediate danger. If not, it could mean further complications. But he would meet them with courtesy, for that was the northern way. He donned his thickest cloak and descended to the courtyard, Sansa at his side, Davos and Lady Mormont flanking them. The gates opened, letting the carriage roll inside, flanked by Tyrell guards dressed in warm furs over their finer southern garments. The carriage door swung open, revealing an older woman wrapped in a thick shawl, Lady Olenna Tyrell herself, the famed Queen of Thorns. She stepped down carefully, a hint of distaste curling her lips at the frigid surroundings. Beside her was a younger woman, elegant and poised, though clearly uncomfortable in the biting cold. 2 Tyrell knights dismounted and offered low bows. Ned stepped forward, inclining his head in a show of respect. "Lady Olenna, we welcome you to Winterfell." Olenna brushed a bit of snow from her sleeve, studying Ned with shrewd eyes. "Yes, well, you could have chosen a warmer place to plant your castle, but I suppose that's out of your hands. We have matters to discuss, Lord Stark. Let's not waste time." Despite the rudeness, Ned simply gestured toward the main keep. "We've prepared chambers. A warm fire awaits. Shall we?" She nodded curtly. The younger woman with her kept her gaze lowered, but Ned could see a flicker of curiosity behind her eyes. If he had to guess, she might be a cousin or niece of the main Tyrell line, possibly the prospective bride for Rickon. He tucked that thought away as the group made their way inside. Servants came forward to help remove cloaks stiff with frost, and the visitors were ushered to a smaller hall with a blazing hearth. Torches and lanterns cast a golden glow on the old stone walls, chasing away the gloom of winter outside. Olenna Tyrell sank into a carved chair with a sigh. She was old, but her mind was razor-sharp and her presence commanded respect. Sansa, seated at Ned's right, poured mulled wine into a cup and offered it to Olenna. The older woman sipped, made a small grunt of approval, then turned her attention to Ned. "Your letter suggested a possible arrangement," she said flatly. "I'm here because I prefer not to see any more gold wasted on a war in the snow. The crown harangues us daily, demanding our fleets and our coin. Most of my dear relatives believe they should bow to the throne's demands. I have other ideas, as you've read." Ned nodded. "We wish to live free in the north, Lady Olenna. The crown has spilled blood on our lands. If we can avoid further conflict by forging an understanding with House Tyrell, we stand ready to do so." Olenna's keen gaze drifted to Rickon, who stood near the hearth, looking politely attentive. "This is the lad I've heard about? Rickon Stark." Rickon bowed his head. "Yes, my lady." She studied him a moment, eyes glittering. "Handsome enough, though a bit rough around the edges. I suppose that's to be expected in these frozen parts. My companion here," she gestured to the young woman, "is Alice Tyrell, a second cousin. Not the highest rung on our family ladder, but she's well-connected and well-educated. She's also unwed, which is why I dragged her here. We'll see if you two can tolerate one another enough to bind our houses. Don't disappoint me, child." Alice blushed and dropped a small curtsy to Rickon, who managed an awkward smile. Ned watched the exchange, mindful of how surreal it must feel to these 2 young people, effectively strangers who might soon be bound in marriage to redirect the course of a realm-wide conflict. Olenna turned back to Ned. "You propose trade and mutual non-aggression. I propose the Tyrells recognize the North's independence so long as the North pledges not to march south or interfere with our affairs. Additionally, should the crown come sniffing around demanding we march to subdue you, we refuse. In return, you grant House Tyrell first rights to certain northern goods, timber, furs, perhaps some metals from your mines, at favorable rates. And we want this alliance sealed with a betrothal, Rickon and Alice." "Agreed." Ned's mind tallied the cost. It was steep, but not extortionate. The Tyrells simply wanted economic advantage and a family bond to protect their interests. If that meant no Tyrell fleet would threaten the North, it might be well worth the price. Still, he would negotiate a few finer points, ensuring the North's shipping fees at White Harbor weren't crippled, that no Tyrell claim to northern lands existed, and that any children of this union would remain Starks, not Tyrells. Those details mattered, but on the broad strokes, it sounded workable. Over the next few hours, they hammered out the terms. Olenna showed her trademark Y. Occasionally snapping at her knights to fetch a quill or at her granddaughter to stop fidgeting. Sansa, calm and composed, held her own in the discussion, pointing out logistical concerns and reaffirming the North's stance. Rickon stayed mostly silent, speaking only when asked about his readiness to commit to the betrothal. The entire negotiation had an air of inevitability, as though war-weary hearts on both sides recognized this was the most reasonable outcome. At last, they produced a written agreement. Davos oversaw the scribes, ensuring each clause was properly recorded. They had one final reading in front of the hearth, the crackle of flames punctuating each passage. The conditions were straightforward: an immediate pledge of neutrality from House Tyrell, including a vow not to supply the crown with ships or gold for any campaign against the North in return. House Stark offered trade concessions and a guarantee that Rickon Stark would wed Alice Tyrell within a year's time. Failure to uphold these terms would void the agreement and allow either side to revert to open conflict. Ned signed with a flourish, then passed the quill to Olenna, who eyed it disdainfully before scrawling her name. Rickon and Alice added theirs, though Ned noted a hint of tremor in Alice's hand. She was younger than Rickon by a year or two, thrust abruptly into the realm of political marriages. Yet she seemed determined enough. Only time would tell if that union bloomed into something genuine or remained an arrangement of convenience. When the final parchment was sealed, Olenna took another sip of mulled wine and leaned back. Well, that's that. I'll return to the Reach soon, though I might linger a few days to rest my old bones. The roads are dreadful, as you know. Her sharp eyes flicked to Ned. See that your enemies do not become ours. House Tyrell honors its pacts, but if you decide to declare war on the entire continent, don't expect my blessing. Ned inclined his head. We want only our independence. No more. Sansa gestured to servants. We've prepared rooms for you and your entourage, Lady Olenna. Fresh bedding, plenty of furs. The old woman rose with some difficulty, brushing off any offered assistance. Very well. Have one of your people fetch me more wine, something stronger if you have it. And young Alice, go introduce yourself to your future in-laws. You'll want to know what you're getting into. With that, Olenna and her knights departed for the guest wing, leaving Alice behind with Rickon. A moment of awkward silence settled, broken when Sansa gently steered the girl toward a seat near the fire and began asking simple questions about her journey, her tastes, her life in Highgarden. Rickon stood by, uncertain how to proceed. Ned watched from a respectful distance, hoping that Alice would at least find kindness and sincerity here. The north might be cold and severe compared to the lush gardens of the Reach, but it was also earnest and steadfast. He prayed those qualities would ease her transition. That night, Ned found himself in the Godswood once more, this time with Sansa at his side. The weirwood loomed, its carved face inscrutable. Snow clung to every branch. The hush was absolute. Sansa spoke softly. Father, do you think we've done the right thing? This alliance could spare us from a devastating war, but Rickon must sacrifice so much. Ned rested a hand gently on her shoulder. I remember my own betrothal to your mother. At first, it was no less a political arrangement. But love and respect grew between us, a bond that gave me more joy than I deserved. Perhaps Rickon and Alice will find their own path. Or perhaps they'll simply maintain a respectful alliance. Either way, if it keeps our people safe, it is a burden worth bearing. Sansa nodded, eyes reflective. I understand. Sometimes I wonder what our lives would be if none of these wars had ever begun. If we were an ordinary family, unburdened by crowns or rebellion or duty. Ned's breath clouded in the cold air. We have the lives we must lead, not the ones we might have chosen. Our legacy now is to see the North free and secure, so future generations can know peace. She tucked her cloak tighter, gazing at the still pool in the center of the grove. Bran says something still stirs across the sea. He worries that no matter what we do here, a larger storm is brewing. Something about dragons. I can't quite understand. Ned frowned. Let's hope if dragons do return, they remember that the North kneels to no king or queen. They stood a while longer, letting the presence of the old gods fill the silence. Ned's thoughts roamed over everything that had happened since they first refused to bend the knee, the battles, the losses, the alliances forged in desperation, the spirit of unity that had risen among the northern houses. Regardless of what the crown did next, House Stark had shaped a new reality. The North stood as its own realm in all but name, defended by its own iron will and the memory of ancient kings who once wore crowns of ice. Within days, Olenna prepared to depart, satisfied that the terms they'd negotiated would be respected. She left a small retinue behind to begin formalizing the trade pacts, while Alice remained as a guest, soon to be betrothed to Rickon in a modest ceremony once the snows eased enough for a few Tyrell representatives to attend. The old woman parted with a final quip, something about how she hoped the North's cold wouldn't kill her knights before she could find a decent bed in a warmer land. Ned returned to the routine of overseeing Winterfell, but now with a slightly lifted heart. The Tyrell fleet would not sail against them, removing a substantial threat. Whispers through the realms suggested the crown was furious. Cersei Lannister was rumored to have raged at the news that the Tyrells and the North had reached a private accord. Tommen's small council threatened sanctions, though what used were sanctions against a kingdom determined to break away. Meanwhile, the North received quiet feelers from other houses. A small number of lords in the Stormlands began to question if they should spill blood for the crown's cause. Some in the Westerlands grew wary of Lannister leadership, especially after Jaime's defeat. Even Dorne, famously independent in its way, watched these developments with interest. The more it looked like the North could stand on its own, the more others wondered if perhaps the Iron Throne was not as mighty as it once appeared. Winter pressed on, unrelenting. The fields froze solid. Wolves howled in the distance, their cries echoing over barren hills. Northmen huddled in their keeps and villages, but they did so with an unbowed spirit. Tales spread of how the Stark banner flew in defiance of any southern king, capturing the imagination of those tired of the same old lines of fealty and subservience. In taverns and halls from the Neck to the Shadow Tower, minstrels began singing new ballads, songs that lauded House Stark's courage, the might of the men who stood at Moat Cailin, and by the White Knife, the cunning alliances that had outfoxed the crown. The wolf that would not kneel, some called it. For Ned Stark, none of this felt like triumph. He carried the weight of the many lives lost, the families torn apart, the uncertain future. Yet as he walked Winterfell's corridors, hearing the hiss of wind outside and the crackle of fires within, he found a measure of solace. The North was no longer shackled to a throne that cared only for its own power. The people here determined their fate, guided by leaders who understood the land's hardship and beauty. That alone was worth every sacrifice. Rickon and Alice spent awkward days in each other's company, gradually learning how to speak without undue stiffness. Sansa gently guided them toward shared activities, listening to the minstrels, walking the battlements, even trying archery in the yard. Rickon discovered that Alice knew quite a lot about horticulture and was fascinated by the idea of cultivating hardy northern crops in a greenhouse. In turn, she asked about dire wolves, a subject that lit a spark in Rickon's eyes. They found small points of connection, the seeds of a friendship that might grow into something stronger over time. Ned watched from a distance, relieved that they at least seemed willing to try. By the time the worst of the winter storms passed, a quiet consensus took shape throughout the realm. The North was independent in all but name. The Crown's armies had not marched in force again. The Tyrells maintained a facade of loyalty to King's Landing while withholding the assistance demanded of them. Other houses wavered, uncertain whether to commit to a losing fight. Despite letters of fury from King's Landing, House Stark held firm. Moats, watchtowers, and the wide northern terrain provided a defense that no southern general wished to test again, especially not while snow still blanketed the roads. And so it was that, with every passing day, the dream of a free North solidified into reality. In time, treaties would be drawn, or perhaps the Crown would wait until a milder season to try yet again. But for now, House Stark stood on its own. From the walls of Winterfell to the fishing villages along the icy shores, a sense of unity pulsed. Where once fear and resignation reigned, pride and determination now thrived. They owed fealty to no king. They had carved out their place in the world through sheer will and the might of their blades. When spring finally hinted at its arrival, the snows beginning to melt, Ned stood on the ramparts, gazing over the white fields that would soon turn muddy and brown. Beyond those fields, beyond the Neck, the rest of Westeros churned with intrigue and uncertainty. Dragons might yet return. The Crown might rebuild its strength. But he felt no dread, only a quiet resolve. Whatever came, the North would face it as free men and women, loyal to their own lords, governed by their own laws. The future belonged to them now. A raven fluttered overhead, circling the towers of Winterfell before gliding down to the rookery. Perhaps it bore tidings of fresh developments to the south. Perhaps it carried word of a new alliance forming or a new threat on the horizon. Ned would face those tidings with the same steadfast calm he had offered all who would subjugate his people. The die was cast, and House Stark's course was set. Within him burned the memory of those earliest days, the moment he first tore a royal letter in half and let the pieces drift into the courtyard. A single act of defiance had kindled a flame that no southern king had managed to extinguish. As the sun broke through leaden clouds, Ned Stark closed his eyes, inhaling the crisp northern air. He thought of the crypts below Winterfell, the stone statues of ancient kings in the north, their direwolves at their feet. For the first time in centuries, it seemed those kings would not be merely relics of history, but a harbinger of the present. The North had risen once more, unbowed, unbroken, forging its own destiny in the face of every threat. And at the heart of that destiny stood House Stark, guardians of the frozen land, watchers of the northern night, and the people who would kneel to no throne but the one they built themselves.